Tax evaders and offshore account holders are exposed by the Pandora Papers. I'm Marco Perry. Welcome to the Perry Platform. The Pandora Papers are a collection of 11.9 million leaked documents with 2.9 terabytes of data. That's a lot. That the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, which are known as the ICIJ, published beginning on October 3rd, 2021. Now, the purpose of these documents were to expose offshore account holders and potential big-ticket tax evaders. Now, before we move too far deep into the story, I want to spend a second to just talk about this International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, the ICIJ. And they're an independent global network of about 280 investigative journalists, so not a major body, but they're partnered with over 100 media organizations spanning more than 100 countries. Now, the organization is based in Washington, D.C., but their personnel is worldwide. In Australia and France and Spain, Hungary, Serbia, Belgium, all of that. So, when you consider the topic of tax evasion and international tax havens, having a body of international journalists, investigative journalists, it makes sense. That's the right team to look into a matter like this, because they come with these global scopes and knowledge, when combined, can lead to an effective report. Typically, they investigate a broad range of matters concerning cross-border crime, corruption, and the accountability of power. Now, this particular leak, the Pandora Papers, and I assume they're called the Pandora Papers in reference to opening up Pandora's box because a lot of crap is about to hit the fan, or so we hope. The leak exposed the secret offshore accounts of 35 world leaders, including current and former presidents, prime ministers, and heads of state, as well as more than 100 billionaires, celebrities, and business leaders. Now, I have looked through the list, and we're talking about a wide array of individuals here. From Shakira, her hips don't lie, but it seems like she does lie. Her hand might lie when she's filling out her tax return. And Tony Blair, who is a past British Prime Minister. Perhaps not the most common names that come to mind when considering tax evasion and offshore tax havens. This is one of those cases where you already knew something was happening. The average person already knew that rich, influential, well-connected people had many ways of gaming the tax system. So, this leak wasn't all that surprising per se. It's just confirming what people already knew was going on. But this proof and these reports now put things into perspective. It's not just the greedy capitalist, it's the people who are running the government. It's the celebrities that some people worship. It's basically everyone who has the means to take advantage of the system. Now, the cherry on top here is that many of these politicians who got caught up in the report were actively campaigning on things like getting rid of these tax evasion policies, getting rid of these loopholes, making sure people pay their fair share and whatnot. And now it comes out that they're just as guilty as the purported opponents that they were looking to take down. Now, to frame this discussion, estimates by the ICIJ put the amount of money held offshore from about 5.6 trillion US dollars to upwards of 32 trillion US dollars. That's a lot of money. Just presume for a second that this money was taxed at the rate that it should have been. You can estimate about 30%. That's a lot of money. In the worst case, we're looking at something like $2 trillion that could have been used towards bettering the country, towards paying for services that people need, towards paying down the debt that many countries took on due to COVID-19. And if you use the $32 trillion estimate, the high end, you could be looking at over $10 trillion that the government's missing out on. It's actually insane. Now, one must wonder naturally, well, if the government and anyone really with a functioning brain, they knew that these rich people were getting away with hiding their money offshore and partaking in tax evasion, why wouldn't they crack down on that more seriously? Why wouldn't that be a priority? After all, we're talking about trillions of dollars that could have been going towards these various government entities. Isn't that a lot of incentive to get something done? Money talks. Well, it turns out that from this report, 35 world leaders, including current and former presidents and prime ministers, are caught up in it too. So, if you're trying to connect the dots here, maybe these people in power weren't incentivized to take action because they knew they were guilty too. Just like the past British Prime Minister, who, when questioned about these leaks, denied any wrongdoing. Of course he would. But the numbers tell a different story. Now, when news of this broke, governments around the world had a variety of reactions. Now, keep in mind as well, as we just talked about, many of the people who got caught up in this leak were actually government officials. So when certain governments say, oh, we don't really care, this is an invasion of privacy, or simply we'll look into it, quote unquote, there could be some connection to the people who were caught up. Now, America, what did they say? Well, they took the easy route. They said they're going to look into it. All the while, people came forward and said, well, while America's looking into it, the reality of the situation is clear. It's a reminder that the United States has two separate tax systems. There's one for the very rich and the very well-connected, and there's one for everybody else. If you, the average Joe, wanted to partake in some tax evasion, wanted to get set up with an offshore account, I can guarantee you're getting busted. The CRA, the IRS, they'll hound you. You might go to jail. Or you won't even be able to get started because it takes connections and it takes resources to even get set up like that. The average person can't do it. They're forced to play the game fairly in some ways. Otherwise, they're taking on tremendous risk. But if you're well connected, you're wealthy. If you have an army of lawyers, if you have an army of accountants, if you have an army of financial advisors, well, the game's a little bit different for you. Now, to be clear, I'm not saying every rich person does this. Of course, there are many who do play fairly. There are many who contribute their fair share to the tax system. And if you look at the data, rich people in Canada or America, however you want to define that, something like the top 20% of income earners in the country, they pay the bulk of taxes that allow you to operate. It's not the poor people or the middle class people who are paying exorbitant taxes to the government. The rich people who do play fairly, they contribute a lot, but there's incentives here for some of the wealthiest among them to not play fairly. Why? Because they stand to gain a lot. This isn't a problem of simply saying something like eat the rich, some Marxist type thinking. It's looking at the reality of the situation and understanding that the game could be set up more optimally for everyone's benefit. Things like these leaks shouldn't be happening. Why? Because the system shouldn't have the incentives in all the wrong places to allow for this behavior to begin with. Moving on, India also promised to look into it. They're going to conduct an investigation. And as we talked about, the press came after the former British Prime Minister, Blair. And he denied everything, as naturally he would. And you go to the EU and you see a better example of what a reaction should look like. They stated that they would introduce new legislation to tackle tax avoidance by the end of the year. That's a proper response. It's not like there's much to look into anyways, because everyone knows, all the data shows that tax evasion is a problem. Now, if you're America, sure, you might want to investigate the individuals here and bring them to justice, but if you don't plug the hole, these leaks will continue to occur. The EU at least is attempting to plug the hole. And they're saying they're going to have something by the end of the year. New laws and bills to tackle tax avoidance. And that's the right way to approach this. To sit down, to think about it, to optimize your strategy, and to get going now. This problem has been ongoing for a long time. Many decades. There's been plenty of time to investigate and to conduct some type of formulation of strategy. It just seems that many countries are not interested in that though. Now, when it comes to Canada in particular, I only noticed a handful of Canadians who were named in the leak. It wasn't an overwhelming number. Take that with a grain of salt, though. The paper doesn't claim to have captured every tax evader in the world. This is likely just a small sample of the total offenders out there. And the way things broke, it might just have been that Canadians were hiding it better, or the sample didn't include a large number of them because they were overlooked. Perhaps something like that. And One must ask, well, tax havens, theoretically, why are they so attractive? And understanding that might help to lead towards a solution. The answer is quite clear. When you look at the tax rates for high income earners, they essentially get to escape paying something like 30% plus on millions, if not billions of dollars by using these tax havens. That's mighty tempting. If you're, just to keep the number simple, if you have an income of $100 million, of course the tax rate is progressive. The lower amounts you've earned at the beginning will be taxed lower, at least in Canada and America. And as you go up, you pay a little bit more per dollar earned after a certain amount. Let's just average that out, though, for the sake of simplicity. We're talking about 30%. From that $100 million, that would be $30 million gone to the government. That's quite significant. And now inflate these numbers. Think about someone earning $1 billion. There's a ton of motivation there to figure out how to save that expense, how to cut it down to zero. So, what do? Well, you open up a bank account in a foreign country with little to no relevant taxes. Then you funnel all your international sales through that. And voila, tax-free earnings. Or you open up a shell company and you declare that as the main corporate entity of your corporation. And you route all your profits through that entity, something like what Apple does. And you say, hey, that money was earned, accounted for in Ireland. Even though the sales occurred in the US and in Canada, this is our main corporate entity, our main corporate body. The money is owed to the Irish government, who has something like a 0% income tax or profit margin, whatever it is. Also, depending on where you set up these offshore accounts, you also get the added benefit of privacy, of secrecy, which enables illegal transfers and all the like. These banks in other countries are in independent nations. They don't have to comply with the IRS or the CIA, or the CRA, or the FBI for that matter. You can pressure them all you want, but they are within a sovereign nation. And if those banks refuse to cooperate with you, what are you going to do? Nothing, unless you want to go to war with the country, or you want to pressure the government to do something about it, which they might not appreciate, especially if these tax havens are making them a good chunk of change. There isn't incentive to cooperate. All you have to do as the IRS or the CRA is wait for the next assortment of Pandora leaks to get out for you to figure out who is gaming the system. Now, a point of clarity that has to be made is that it's not illegal to have offshore accounts. Maybe it should be. Maybe that would be the problem solver here, but as it stands, at least in Canada, you can do that. You can open up a bank account in the Cayman Islands if you want to. You won't go to jail for that. The illegal part comes in when you account for poor reporting, fancy accounting, and tax avoidance, tax evasion, not reporting income and profits that should be taxable under Canadian law. And that's what many people are taking part in, those with the resources and those with the access. Why? Because they stand to gain a lot. And hypothetically, if they got caught, what would happen? Would they pay a fine? And how much would the fine be? You see this play out a lot with corporations. They're going to pollute a lake and they're going to make what? Let's just say $100 million in extra profit from that activity. Then they get caught, they go to court, and they get fined. And they get fined for something like $10 million. Well, do the math there. If they stand to gain 100 and they're getting fined for 10, that fine is really just a cost of doing business. They're still making away like a bandit with all the other money. These fines have been approached in an insane way. If you really want to deter someone from taking part in illicit activity, the consequences, first of all, have to be believable. You actually have to catch people. And second, the penalty has to be greater and far greater than the reward. If someone stands to gain 10 and they're going to lose 1 by getting caught, or they stand to gain 100 and they're going to lose 10 by getting caught, of course they're going to try. Of course, they won't even care if they get caught because they win either way. If you stand to gain 100 million, but the penalty is 1 billion, well, you're going to think twice about that, especially if you've seen a lot of people get caught and held accountable and brought to justice. If you go to the convenience store and you know that robbing them for a $2 bag of chips is going to land you in jail for 5 years, you're going to run the math in your head and say it's not worth it. You have to make it not worth it for these companies and people to partake. It's all about the incentives. And finally, when I hear calls for people to tax wealth and all these other things, and they don't talk about fixing the system as it currently stands, how do you think things are going to play out? The people who you're imagining taxing, like Bezos and Shakira and whoever else you would consider super wealthy, they're going to have ways to get around that. They're already getting around things like income tax. And now something like wealth tax, which is more abstract, they're going to dance around it. But the average person is going to get screwed. The person who's worked hard and they're an engineer or they're a doctor or whatever, maybe you don't consider them super wealthy, but maybe they're hitting those brackets where a wealth tax would come into play. That's a whole debate there. Where do you enable it? Where do you not? But someone like that, without the proper resources, is more likely to get caught up in whatever proposal you have than those who you're hypothetically really trying to target. The first thing we have to do is get the system in order. And by doing that, we might not even need the wealth tax. We're talking about trillions of dollars left unaccounted for. The tax revenue from getting that under control, that windfall might be enough to even just eradicate the need for the discussion of a wealth tax. We have to see. But regardless, that's the first step here. Like always, I will keep you up to date on the latest developments here with the Pandora Papers leak. And with that, it does bring us to the end of our conversation for today. If you enjoyed the content, be sure to leave a review and share. It'll help us grow. And you can find me online at perryplatform.org and on social media at perryplatform. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you soon.